Somewhere on Salisbury Plain, there's a village where the church bells haven't rung since 1943. The houses still stand. The streets still have names. But nobody has lived there in over 80 years because the British Army won't let them. The residents were promised they could return in 6 months. That promise was a lie. And this isn't even the strangest abandoned place we're covering today. Britain has more ghost towns, derelict mansions, and forgotten facilities than most people realise. We're not talking about medieval castle ruins or bombed-out World War II sites everyone already knows about. We're talking about Victorian asylums, where thousands died in misery. Brutalist architectural masterpieces left to rot after just 7 years. Secret underground bunkers built to fight an invasion that never came. And theme parks where rusting roller coasters sit frozen mid-loop next to actual medieval castle ruins. Some of these places were abandoned by choice. Others were evacuated by force. Some killed the people inside them before anyone understood why. And at least one was built so poorly that water started destroying it before construction even finished. These aren't ancient ruins. Most of these abandonment stories happened within living memory. Your grandparents might remember when these places were thriving. Today, we're exploring 10 abandoned places in Britain that genuinely surprised me when I researched them. Let's start with the one the government tried hardest to erase. Number 10 takes us to Imber in Wiltshire. Population in 1943 was around 150. Current population is 0, and it's staying that way. This village appears in the Domesday Book from 1086. Nearly 1,000 years of continuous habitation. Families farming the same land their ancestors worked for generations. Then came November 1st, 1943. The residents were summoned to a meeting in the village schoolroom. American troops needed somewhere to practice urban warfare before D-Day. Everyone had 47 days to pack their lives and leave. The promise was clear. 6 months maximum, then you can come home. Except that promise appears nowhere in the official eviction orders. Funny how that works. By December 17th, 1943, Imber was empty. The Americans trained. D-Day happened. The war ended, and the villagers prepared to return home, just like they'd been promised. The Ministry of Defence had other ideas. At the end of the war, efforts were made to restore Imber to pre-war condition, though there was very little damage. But the decision was taken not to relinquish control. The village would remain a military training area, permanently. Documentary evidence of that return agreement wasn't discovered until the 1970s, 3 decades too late for most of the original residents. They'd already rebuilt their lives elsewhere. Their children had grown up in different towns. The community that existed for nearly a millennium was erased in less than a decade. What makes Imber especially bitter is what happened after the eviction. UK military operations began using the village for live fire exercises. Buildings that survived centuries took shell and explosion damage. Weather did the rest. Structures that could have been preserved were allowed to deteriorate. Whether this was deliberate or simple neglect, the effect was the same. Making the village uninhabitable ensured nobody could argue for its return. Today, Imber sits in restricted military land. You can visit on designated open days, maybe half a dozen times per year. Walk down the main street that follows an ancient stream. See the Church of St. Giles, maintained but empty. Peer into buildings that once housed families who believed they'd return. The village exists in a strange state. Not quite ruins, not quite preserved, just frozen as a training ground for urban warfare. The descendants of Imber's residents have fought for decades to reclaim their ancestral home. Every attempt has failed. The Ministry of Defence maintains the land is too valuable for training purposes. There's cruel irony here. A village, evacuated temporarily for wartime necessity, remains occupied by the military 80 years later during peacetime. The sacrifice was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent without anyone's consent. But Imber isn't unique in British history. It's just the most documented example of communities erased for military purposes. During World War II, the government requisitioned land across Britain with similar promises of temporary use. How many of those promises were kept? How many communities never came back? Moving from forced evacuation to voluntary abandonment, number 9 brings us to Loudoun Castle Theme Park in Scotland. This one operated from 1995 to 2010, which means some of you probably visited it. Peak attendance reached hundreds of thousands annually. Current visitors are trespassers and urban explorers risking prosecution. Loudoun Castle itself dates back centuries, a genuine medieval fortress. By the 20th century, the estate had fallen into ruin. Someone looked at those romantic castle ruins and thought, you know what this needs? Roller coasters. In 1995, the theme park opened on the grounds surrounding the ruined castle. For 15 years, it actually worked. Families rode the Twist and Shout, the Lady Bird, and various other attractions with medieval stonework as the backdrop. Then on June 11, 2010, a park employee died in an accident involving one of the rides. The subsequent investigation and lawsuit found the park ownership not guilty of failing to provide adequate training. That legal victory meant nothing. The park was declared no longer economically viable and closed immediately after the trial. Whether the death directly caused the closure or merely accelerated existing financial problems, the result was the same. Within weeks, Loudoun Castle Theme Park was abandoned. What you get now is genuinely surreal. Rusting roller coaster tracks wind between trees. The Twist and Shout sits frozen, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. Ticket booths with faded paint stand empty. And looming over everything, the actual medieval castle ruins that preceded the theme park by 700 years. There's something darkly poetic about it. The castle ruins that inspired the theme park now watch the theme park itself become ruins. Two eras of abandonment occupying the same space. Visitors once paid to experience manufactured medieval atmosphere next to real medieval ruins. Now, both are equally derelict. The contrast creates uncomfortable questions about what we preserve and what we abandon. A medieval castle watches modern rides rust, but that's just surface-level abandonment. Number 8 takes us underground. Beneath Britain's fields and forests, over 600 secret bunkers remain from World War II, possibly more than 1,000. Most people have no idea they exist. These weren't official military installations. They were hideouts for resistance fighters who would activate if Germany invaded. The British Army built them in absolute secrecy between 1940 and 1944. Each bunker housed 6 to 8 men who'd conduct sabotage operations behind enemy lines. The invasion never came. The bunkers were supposed to be destroyed after the war. Many weren't. Here's what makes these bunkers disturbing. They're everywhere, under farms, in forests, beneath residential areas. One was constructed below the basement of a burnt-out manor house. Another inside a badger's den. One used an old root cellar as its entrance. The military got creative when building bases meant to stay hidden forever. Standard dimensions were 12 to 15 feet long, tall enough to stand in. One end had an entrance shaft, lined with brick or corrugated steel. The other had an escape tunnel, typically concrete, running 20 to 30 feet from the main chamber. Inside, fighters would have stored weapons, explosives, food, and radio equipment. They'd live underground for weeks, conducting guerrilla warfare against occupying forces. The fighters themselves were volunteers, sworn to secrecy. Many took their knowledge to the grave. Their families had no idea what they'd trained for. Documentation was deliberately sparse. After the war, the government wanted these bunkers forgotten, destroyed, erased from memory and landscape both. But concrete doesn't decompose easily. Neither do secrets. Historians and enthusiasts have spent decades documenting these installations, when they can find them. Large concrete hatches in the middle of fields, unusual depressions in forest floors, brick-lined shafts hidden under vegetation. Each one represents a piece of invasion preparation Britain once forgotten. The Cold War added another layer. During the 1950s through 1991, Britain established the Royal Observer Corps monitoring posts. Volunteers manned these underground bunkers, watching for nuclear activity. If missiles launched, these observers would track fallout patterns and report to military command. Almost half closed in 1968 when the Corps downsized. The remainder shut down in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, both types of bunkers decay across Britain. Some flood, some collapse. A few have been converted into museums or storage. Most just sit there, slowly filling with water and earth, waiting for explorers who'll never find them. Moving from military secrets to Victorian nightmares, Number 7 brings us to North Wales Hospital in Denbighshire. Originally the North Wales County's lunatic asylum, this was the first psychiatric hospital in Wales. It opened in 1848. At its peak, in the mid-20th century, 1,500 patients lived here. The Victorian asylum system promised humane treatment. New attitudes toward mental health care, they said. Purpose-built facilities instead of prisons and workhouses. The reality was overcrowding, understaffing, and treatments that ranged from ineffective to cruel. By 1914, over 100,000 patients occupied more than 100 mental institutions across Britain. Most of those institutions were built after the 1845 Lunacy Act mandated proper facilities. North Wales Hospital housed children with learning disabilities, dementia patients, addiction cases, epileptics, and mental health patients. Staff shortages meant care was minimal. Medical knowledge was limited. What passed for treatment would be considered torture now. Patients who entered rarely left. Families institutionalized relatives for conditions we'd treat with medication today. The hospital closed decades ago. The buildings remain. Walking through abandoned wards, you find remnants of lives lived in confinement. Patient records scattered across floors, restraint equipment, treatment rooms with equipment still in place. The architecture itself tells the story. Long corridors designed for observation, small rooms with heavy doors, high windows preventing escape. Whittingham Hospital in Lancashire was even larger. Constructed in 1869, it became Britain's biggest asylum, over 3,500 patients at peak capacity. The complex sprawled across acres, self-sufficient, with its own farm, chapel and burial ground. Many patients who died there never left. Cemetery plots marked with numbers instead of names, because families didn't claim the bodies. These Victorian asylums represent a specific historical moment. Society acknowledged mental illness required treatment, not punishment. But understanding was primitive. Resources were insufficient. The result was warehousing humans in buildings that looked like prisons. The asylums closed throughout the late 20th century as community care became policy. The buildings were abandoned, too large to repurpose, too expensive to maintain, too controversial to demolish. Number 6 shifts from institutional horror to aristocratic collapse. Witley Court in Worcestershire was one of Britain's grandest country houses. Thomas Foley bought the estate in 1655 when it was a medieval manor. The Foley family transformed it into a Jacobean mansion and owned it for nearly 2 centuries. In 1833, they sold to William Ward, who became the first Earl of Dudley. Ward hired architect Samuel Dawkes to create an Italianate palace. Completed around 1860, Witley Court became legendary for lavish house parties. The Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, visited regularly with his associates. The spectacular Perseus and Andromeda fountain in the gardens was Europe's largest. Water shot 120 feet into the air. Guests included everyone who mattered in Victorian society. Then came September 9th, 1937. A fire started in the southeast wing. It spread rapidly through the building. By morning, much of Witley Court was a burnt shell. The estate was broken up and sold. The house was stripped of fittings and furnishings. For 40 years it decayed, open to weather and vandals. In 1972, the Department of the Environment took control. English Heritage manages it now. You can visit the ruins. Walk through roofless halls where orchestras once played. Stand in the ballroom open to the sky. The Perseus fountain still operates during demonstrations, shooting water over ruins instead of manicured gardens. What strikes visitors is the scale. This wasn't a large house. It was a palace. The kind of wealth required to build and maintain Witley Court is almost incomprehensible. Then it burned and nobody rebuilt it. The cost was too high. The era had passed. Grand country houses were becoming financial burdens across Britain. Witley Court became a monument to that shift. Number 5 takes us to Scotland and one of the strangest architectural stories in Britain. St. Peter's Seminary near Cardross looks like a concrete spaceship that crash-landed in the Scottish countryside and was left to rot. Designed by Gillespie, Kidd and Coyer, this brutalist masterpiece opened in 1966 to train Catholic priests. Docomomo International called it a building of world significance. It's one of only 42 post-war buildings in Scotland with Category A listing, the highest level of protection. The design owed everything to Le Corbusier: rough concrete, dramatic angles, integration with landscape. Architecture critic Jonathan Glancy wrote that Corbusier's style translated surprisingly well to Scotland, becoming a natural successor to traditional Scottish tower houses with their rugged forms and tough materials. The seminary trained priests for 14 years. Then it closed in February 1980. The Archdiocese moved operations to Glasgow. In 1983, the Cardross site became a drug rehabilitation centre. But the buildings had problems from day one: chronic water ingress, heating failures. The modern design looked stunning, but functioned terribly in Scottish weather. By 1984, the rehabilitation centre abandoned the seminary buildings and confined operations to the older Kilmahue House. The seminary closed completely in 1987. Vandalism started immediately. Today, it's a concrete skeleton, walls covered in graffiti, vegetation pushing through floors, water pouring through collapsed roofs. The irony is brutal. A building so architecturally significant it received the highest protection is simultaneously so damaged it can't be saved. Restoration estimates run into tens of millions. Nobody wants to pay. So it sits there, decaying slowly, protected by law, but destroyed by weather. Number 4 drops us into military history most people don't know exists. Scattered across Britain are over 600 secret underground bunkers built during World War II. Possibly over 1,000. Nobody knows the exact number because many were never documented. The British Army constructed these bases for auxiliary units, small groups of fighters who'd activate if Germany invaded. The bunkers were typically 12 to 15 feet long, tall enough to stand in, with an entrance shaft at one end and an escape tunnel at the other. Some were built in abandoned manor basements. One was constructed in a badger's den, another in an old root cellar. After the war, they were supposed to be destroyed. Most weren't. They were simply abandoned and forgotten. During the Cold War, many were repurposed for the Royal Observer Corps, volunteers tasked with monitoring nuclear activity. These posts had large concrete hatches in the ground, making them easier to spot. Almost half closed in 1968, when the ROC shrunk. Others closed over the next 40 years due to flooding and structural problems. The remainder shut in 1991 after the communist bloc collapsed. Today, historians and enthusiasts hunt for these bunkers. Most are on private land. Some are flooded, others have collapsed. But they exist under fields, forests and farmland across Britain, silent remnants of wars both hot and cold. Number 3 is Imber in Wiltshire, and this one makes people angry. Imber appears in the Domesday Book of 1086. For nearly 900 years, people lived there, farming the isolated Salisbury Plain. Population was around 150. On November 1st, 1943, residents were called to a meeting in the village schoolroom. They were given 47 days' notice to leave. The military needed Imber for American troops preparing for D-Day. They'd practiced street fighting. The villagers were told they could return in 6 months. They never could. After the war, efforts were made to restore Imber, but the decision was made to keep it. The villagers were not allowed back. Documentary evidence of a return agreement wasn't discovered until the 1970s. The betrayal was complete. Today, Imber remains under Ministry of Defence control. It's used for urban warfare training. Shell and explosion damage is visible on buildings. Weather has eroded what ordnance didn't destroy. The village is accessible only on designated open days, a few times per year. Families of former residents visit on these days. They walk streets their grandparents knew. They stand in front of houses that were taken from them. The church still stands, used occasionally for services. Everything else is ruins, maintained just enough for military exercises. Number 2 brings us to something completely different. The Beeching Axe of 1963 closed 4,500 route miles of railway, 2,500 stations, and eliminated 67,000 jobs. Dr. Richard Beeching's report, The Reshaping of British Railways, carved up Britain's rail network faster than anything in peacetime history. Before World War I, Britain had 23,440 route miles of track. By 1963, much of it was gone. What remains are approximately 600 disused railway tunnels, some over 3 miles long, and countless abandoned stations slowly rotting into the landscape. The Parkland Walk in North London follows the old railway from Finsbury Park through Crouch End and Highgate to Alexandra Palace. In the 1870s, this line carried 60,000 passengers on one Whit Monday. Now it's a nature trail through abandoned platforms and overgrown tracks. Crouch End station platforms still exist. The old Highgate high-level station from 1867 sits directly above the current Highgate tube station that opened in 1941. Walking these routes feels like exploring parallel transport history. One system thriving underground, another decaying above. Many abandoned lines have been repurposed as cycleways or nature reserves. Others just decay. Tunnels flooding, platforms crumbling, buildings stripped by vandals and weather both. Number 1 is Berkyn Manor near Imber in Buckinghamshire. This is the only fully abandoned British mansion on our list, and it's extraordinary. The manor's history traces back to the 15th century. John Milton, author of Paradise Lost, once visited. The last resident died in 1987. For over 30 years it sat empty. What makes Berkyn Manor unsettling is how intact it remains. Furniture still in rooms, a vast library with dusty books on shelves, personal belongings scattered throughout. Layers of thick dust and cobwebs cover everything. Certain areas are now structurally unsafe. The roof leaks, floors sag, but walking through feels like the residents just stepped out and never returned. Economic pressures destroyed Britain's grand houses throughout the 20th century. After the World Wars, maintenance costs skyrocketed, taxes increased, utility costs became unbearable. Many families sold or demolished estates they'd owned for centuries. Berkyn Manor survived longer than most, before its owners finally abandoned it. The property is frozen in decay. Not quite ruins, not quite preserved, just slowly collapsing under its own weight and the passage of time. It's reportedly haunted, which tracks given its condition and history. Whether ghosts exist or not, there's definitely something unsettling about a 500-year-old manor left to rot, with all its contents still inside. These 10 locations represent different types of abandonment. Military necessity took Imber. Economic collapse killed Loudoun Castle. Architectural failure doomed St. Peter's Seminary. Fire destroyed Witley Court. Policy changes closed the asylums and railways, but the pattern underneath is the same. Communities, institutions and structures that seemed permanent simply stopped. The people who built these places believed in futures that never arrived. Imber's residents thought they'd return in 6 months. Loudoun Castle investors thought the theme park would last decades. St. Peter's Seminary was designed to train priests for generations. Every abandoned place started with optimism and ended with empty buildings. Britain's landscape is archaeology in real time. Medieval castles, Victorian asylums, brutalist seminaries, Cold War bunkers, all layered across the same small island. Some are preserved, most are left to decay. A few are deliberately maintained as ruins. What connects them is impermanence. Nothing lasts, not promises, not architecture, not communities. The ground you're standing on right now might be someone's ghost town in a century. That's the lesson these places teach if you're paying attention.